you wear. The coach, yay, the recording is working. Great. So there's 3 different roles that we take on, and I've represented these with the 3 hats: your coach hat, your evaluator hat, and those I've gotten from that great book that we're reading together, the Coach Approach book. And then I've added the cheerleader hat. That's the hat that encompasses the things that you said about when you're just going in there to make connections, when you're just going to celebrate. So just think about the content that we talk about in just the next few minutes with those 3 roles in mind. Okay, so what I'd like to do first is to talk about to get intentional about wearing these hats. The first thing that you do when you're a great coach is you create your playbook, right? So you set yourself up for success in wearing the 3 different hats, because we can pop into classrooms for all these different reasons. And if we get intentional, we're going to be more efficient and we're going to do a better job. So the 3 main things that we're going to talk about as far as creating your playbook go are your classroom visitation rapport, building that, data collection, walkthroughs and monitoring, and then rituals and routines. So as far as building your classroom visitation rapport, so one of the things that the book shares and that we're learning together, and this is something that I think a lot of us have done in different ways, but involving your teachers in the what and why of observation. Now, a lot of times I've involved my teachers in the what or why of my coaching, and when I go and I give them feedback, but I hadn't really thought about being very intentional that there are 3 different roles that I'm going to be wearing when I actually go into your rooms. In the past, I've tried to say things like, oh, don't worry, I'm just going in there to see the great things you're doing. Well, they don't buy that. They know, they know. So, I mean, we when Dr. Drummond was talking about building that culture of vulnerability, we want to build that culture with our teachers. And, the whole goal is that we want to be able to coach them and them to learn from us. So something that we talked about in our last cohort group was just the importance of involving those teachers in why you're observing. And so we've got those 3 different hats. So basically, that's one way you can frame it for your teachers. When I'm in your classroom, I will be wearing these different hats. And this week, I'm going to be wearing the cheerleader hat. Or when I come in the morning just to pop in and I'm leaving you notes, just know it's safe. And I'll be wearing that cheerleader hat a lot. Another one, and this is one that I have done, and the collaboratively collaboratively developing look fors with your teachers. So this is another idea that we'll talk about in just a second. Okay, so when you're creating your playbook and you're thinking about these roles, okay, there are times when you're going in, even when you're wearing that cheerleading hat, even when you're wearing a coaching hat, you're collecting data. So what the first thing that we're going to talk about is deciding on an instructional focus for a period of time. This is one suggestion that I have personally. This is a Liz thing. So what has helped me a lot is like when you're going into classrooms, quantity sometimes will trump quality. I found I had gotten into a bad habit when I was an assistant principal of thinking that every time I needed to go into a classroom, I needed to be given like the best feedback and leaving these great notes. And what that did was that kept me from getting into classrooms often. So you just need to tell yourself that there are lots of times that I'm just going to be going into classrooms to wear that cheerleader hat, and that is okay. So when you switch hats and you're thinking, okay, I want to go in and give feedback, or if I'm just collecting data so I can have conversations later on, and I'm just doing those walkthroughs, there are tons of things you can look for. And if you're spending 20 minutes in a classroom, 30 minutes every time you're doing a look for, you're not going to get in very many classrooms. So something that I have found that has helped me is I've usually done a monthly focus, and I've based these on our school initiatives. Like, so for example, 1 month, we might be like at the beginning of the year, I just looked for things related to school culture and classroom culture and building those relationships with students. And those are the kinds of things that when I talked a minute ago about collaboratively developing look-fors with the teachers, that's when you do that and say, guys, at the beginning of the year, I'm going to be wearing this coaching hat for you. And when I go in your classrooms, I'm going to be looking for student engagement. What are some things I should be seeing in your classroom? So that builds that culture of vulnerability. It gets them to buy-in, and it also helps them to understand and feel safer when you go in there. These blue items here that are underlined are links. So the culture one that you see there, it looks really ugly because it's like the PDF of the Google form that I used to go into Classroom. So I made basically a different Google form for each one of my walkthroughs. So like I said, at the beginning, I would be looking for culture. Then it would, like towards October, I would be looking for student engagement. And then towards like when we all came back and we're fresh in February after the snow and we're really trying to dig in there, I would really try to be looking for high expectations. So I had different look-fors, different walkthrough instruments for each of these. And I'd be happy to share any of those too. Also, another great resource for if you are into that, if you think, oh, that's a cool idea, I want to create my own walkthrough just based on one theme. I use the Elliott, that's through Advanced Ed. So if you click on the link for the Elliott right there, you'll see their complete walkthrough instrument. And then they have the different categories of the different like themes, like, classroom environment, student engagement, those kinds of things. They have it worded differently. But I basically took each section and made it its own little walkthrough instrument. That's how I did it. Something that I have found is that when I'm doing my walkthroughs and it's just for the purpose of data collection and monitoring, I always had to have congruence as a focus. As it's really, the thing that I would have is that it was hard for me to be checking off the learning target, checking off all of these different things, and then staying in there to look for something related to student engagement. So I always had a Google form for lesson essentials, and that's what I called it, and it was just focused on congruence. When I had I was an elementary principal, so I didn't have an assistant principal. It was just me trying to do all this. I had a counselor at one point who was interested in administration, and so she would just help me. So it wasn't evaluative. She would just help me by using the lesson essentials walkthrough instrument that I created, so that she could just check off when she was the learning target, if the teacher had their lesson plans ready to go, either through Drive or whatever. So that's how I balanced always looking for congruence with looking at these other walkthrough instruments too. I used her. Another thing that I did this last year when I lost my counselor, I had another counselor who was fresh out of the classroom and wasn't really comfortable going into classrooms. So I created, where it says somehow there, I created this thing that I called the planning protocol, where I had the teachers turn in to me. It was just what they're learning, like their main learning targets for reading and math. And then I had them staple their main exit slip for the week. It was what we called our formative assessment, and what their activities were, just to jot down a few places or they could connect their lesson plans. So that way I could check congruence between the target, what they were doing in the classroom, and their exit slip. So they just turned that into me when I couldn't, but I didn't have an extra person to help check. Okay, so all of this is all the other, kind of like all the other stuff you have to do besides coaching, right? But this is collecting data that you need for that coaching. Another great, oops, I'm not sure why it did that. I guess I hovered too long. So another great resource that I used for just tracking and being efficient with my walkthroughs was Justin Bader's Classroom Visit Index cards. These are awesome. If you've never used these, I highly recommend them. I had my attendance clerk. She helped me create these, and you have one card for each teacher's name, and then you have their schedule on it. And then I would pull out, it helps you, like, you just keep track of when you've been in their classroom. So I would pull out like 3 a day to make sure I went into classrooms for these purposes for my walkthrough. Okay, so what hats are you wearing during these types of walkthroughs? So when you're doing those, we all do them, right? The walkthroughs for data and monitoring, and you have those specific things, whether you're monitoring for congruence, put in the chat box real quick. What hats are you wearing? Coach, cheerleader, evaluator, coach. Right. So basically, if you look at it, when you're doing your walkthroughs and you've got specific walkthrough data that you're look for that you're trying to collect data on, you could be celebrating that. But mainly what I would think of is that I was using my evaluator hat and my coaching hat, either or, because I was collecting data for conversations later on. How do you do visits for the purpose of monitoring and data collection? So in the chat box, this is just a moment for you to share any ideas that you have that you could, that someone else could benefit from. Why does it keep doing that? Trust-based observations, coach, we use a Google form. So hopefully that you've got just a couple ideas to help make that process more efficient. A lot of us use Google forms. We do different types of observations. Okay, so now we're going to put our coach hat on. So the premise is you've collected your data from these different types of walkthroughs, and now you want to coach the teacher. So ironically, the funny thing is that like throughout this coaching process, when you go through the cognitive coaching training, they have you separate out evaluation from coaching, right? And that principals have to wear both hats. But ironically, I found my best opportunities for coaching before and after an evaluative mini or full observation. So the way I saw this process is my walkthroughs, I was collecting data for look fors. And when I gave feedback on those, I just gave positive feedback on those. And I saved anything that was like a learning, a critical feedback for those times. And I felt like that helped build the vulnerability and safety too. So with the cognitive coaching, the idea is that you do your coaching through conversations. And if anyone gets the opportunity to go through cognitive coaching, it's through the Thoughtful Classroom. And that's one of the links that are in the PowerPoint. And then I put on the sheet that goes with our grid. Your job is to ask questions, pause and paraphrase to help mediate the teacher's thinking. So the idea is that the coaching part of all of this is you're getting away from judgment, right? So that the teacher doesn't constantly feel evaluated and judged. So we're wearing our coach's hat. We've collected our data from walkthroughs. We've given them, like you said, some of you all said that you're wearing the cheerleading hat when you go in there. You're just giving them some positives, but you're also filing some of the things that you see away. And you're thinking, okay, I'm gonna use some of this data that I'm collecting to coach them. And then you have those conversations. So coaching through the conversation, what you learn in the cognitive coaching is that there's 3 main types of conversations you have. So I'm gonna hit on 2 of them. One is the reflecting conversation. So this is the conversation you have after an observation. And there are different steps that you go through, and I have 6 minutes left, so I'm gonna kind of go through quickly. But basically, it's a lot of us start the way we always start those reflective conversations. You summarize your impressions. How do you think it went? But then what you do is it's a little bit different. Before I learned cognitive coaching, I'd be like, oh, how do you think the lesson went? And then the teachers are going, okay, there's a right answer here, right? And then you would jump in and be like, yeah, you really hit it, right? Or actually, this is what I saw. So this is a little bit different in that you're pulling on the teacher's thinking. So instead of being like, oh yeah, okay, let me tell you the good things and bad things in my evaluator hat, let's talk about your thinking. So you paraphrase what they say, And then that gets them to think a little bit deeper and make sure you've nailed it. And then you go on to this part that's called analyzing causal factors. And that's where you ask them questions. What kind of comparisons might you have had between how you planned it and how it went? And then that kind of pushes them a little bit further. Then third part, construct new learning. What do you want to take with you from, or what are you learning from teaching this lesson? So I love that, because so if you're thinking to yourself, what can I get from today? I love this whole part here as far as setting up this whole atmosphere and culture of learning throughout your school. If you really want your teachers to see that these, I'm here to coach you, I'm trying to help you, then see these little observations as, what are you learning from teaching this lesson? Not what am I going to judge based on what I saw. Then the reflecting conversation, the last two parts, commit to application. So how might you apply your new learning? So you ask that to the teachers, then you paraphrase what they say. And then the last part is you get them to see the conversation as their learning opportunity. As you reflect on this conversation, how has it supported your learning? So that, I love that too. So it's so funny, when I started doing that with my teachers this year, it would be like, it was a little awkward and we'd laugh a little bit, because I used to ask them questions like, has this conversation helped you? And as your boss, there's one right answer, right? But if you get them in the habit of reflecting on the conversation, it gets them to think, oh, okay, this is a whole new way of me thinking about observations. And then at some point you might have to switch to that evaluator hat, which is fine. It's just a different purpose for your conversation, and you can switch into that. So basically what I would do when I would do like one of those mini observations or full observation, I would do the full observation. I would have this reflecting conversation, and I would say, okay, first we're going to have the coaching hat on, and we're going to do this. And then I would say, okay, switch into the evaluator hat. Let's do the rubric. Let's go to the Danielson framework or whatever it is your district is using. And then you would tell them where they were on the rubric. And that worked best for me. And sometimes, like, depending on where the teacher was in their thinking or in their skill level, like if they were somebody who was a superstar, I might do the evaluative part first in the coaching conversation, and the post observation conference, and say, okay, let's get this out of the way. That you're a rock star. Look at you. You're over here. You're exemplary. Da, 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 da. Okay, now you've earned your A. Let's get on to reflection. Okay. So what do you do when you need to intervene? Okay. Sometimes it's going to be a train wreck, right? When you go into a classroom and you got 2 minutes left. Okay. And you're going to have to intervene. So that's when you just say, okay, I need to put my evaluator hat on first. Okay. So, when the students were all getting up during your direct instruction, that kind of thing. So you just tell them, you just be very upfront. If you want to use your post observation conferences a little bit differently, you just be very clear up front. I've got my coach hat on now. I've got my evaluator hat on now. And that worked well for me. Okay, so that's what I just said. You just say, I'm going to switch hats for a minute. All right. Now, the other conversation really quick is the planning conversation. So the planning conversation is what happens before you go and observe. Okay, and this is where, like, I've used this a lot with my brand new teachers that are having a hard time planning. So basically, this one's pretty straightforward. What's your goal? Right? What is your goal? What do you want your kids to learn this week in reading? Specify success indicators. What evidence will you collect to know that you've met your goal? And then here is the learning activities. Anticipate approaches. What might be some strategies you considered? I love these three, especially with my new teachers, because how young brand new teachers, not to be a bias or anything or stereotype, but we're all, I was this way, activity focused. I want to create this great new lesson, and I'm so excited to do this activity with my my students? Well, I always, was hammering home backwards planning. So this kind of leads them through that. Okay. Last two parts of that planning conversation, establishing your personal learning focus. So what do you want to make sure you do really well in this lesson? And how might you're doing that well? So those are, those are two. Now we're switching to that, okay, I'm getting into teaching my teachers how to be reflective, right? And really using this upcoming lesson, especially if you're doing it as a pre-observation conference, as a learning lesson. What am I going to learn from this lesson? And then the last, reflect on coaching. As you reflect on this conversation, how has it supported your learning? So cognitive coaching, that comes from I call it the thoughtful classroom, but it's the thinking collaborative. I'm sorry, I get confused. The thinking collaborative. If you're interested, if you, the coaching part, and you're like, man, that sounds awesome. That's something I want to dig into. Cognitive coaching was offered by OVET, and the P3 network offers a scholarship for principals to get cognitive coach. So look for that. And then the coach approach to school leadership is the one that kind of, for me, put all the pieces together as a principal and how to balance this. So feedback is what I mentioned earlier. That's when you switch your hat. So when you think, okay, I just need to give the teacher specific feedback within these conversations, you just be upfront. Changing my coach hat. Okay. I think I did. I talked really fast, but I think I did.
You did, but I did not want to stop you because I knew you were so close to the end. And Ms. Noah has reminded us that round 2 does begin at 9:50. We do have other breakout rooms. If you want to continue this really good conversation, because there's so much to cover here, we do have breakout rooms 11 through 15 open and reserved